I'm going to go ahead and kick us off. Thank you all for joining us. I'm Wendy Proctor. I'm a partner in Husch Blackwell's Real Estate Development and Construction Group. Our Austin office is located just down the street from the SoCo area, so it's nice to get to talk to people who are our neighbors. Today we'll be discussing COVID-19 related topics and how they will impact the South Congress Public Improvement District. Before we begin, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. If you have any questions during the program, please submit your questions via the chat feature button on the control tray at the bottom of the viewing window. We will try to answer questions during the webcast today, but if a fuller answer is needed or we run out of time, it will be answered later via email. And we truly do appreciate any audience participation, so we encourage you to submit questions. If you have any technical difficulties, please click on the Help tab at the bottom left of the viewing window. This tab provides information regarding common technical issues. Also, a recording of the webcast will be available tomorrow for watching and sharing. Once available, a link to the recording will be emailed to you. Just also wanted to point out that the materials that we're going to be presenting are intended to be a high-level overview. Obviously, individual circumstances might change or create some additional nuance to an answer that we might give. So just kind of bear in mind this is intended to be high-level and general. I understand that we have, landlords, tenants, owners, developers. We have kind of a hotel, different uses and different parties. We've tried to kind of present information that might be useful, to everyone in our audience. So some of the things we talk about may be more specific to you and some to others. Joining me today is Eric Eisenman, Jessica Zaratsky, and Micah King. Eric is a partner in our labor and employment group and helps businesses manage their most valuable assets, their employees. He counsels employers of all sizes, from small businesses to Fortune 100 companies, often helping them draft and enforce employment contracts, restrictive covenants, and other workplace agreements. Jessica is a partner in our financial services and capital markets group and represents financial institutions and other lenders, secured and unsecured creditors, privately held and publicly traded businesses, school districts, and government authorities. Micah is an attorney in our real estate development and construction group and advocates for clients regarding local government, real estate, and construction needs. He is passionate about the built environment and physical world and enjoys having a connection to growing the community. So in addition to eating a lot of pizza, he also is very connected with what's going on in the community. Thank you for joining us on the program today. And with that, I'm going to turn everything over to Jessica.
Great. Thanks, Wendy. Can everybody hear me okay? We're good?
Yep.
Great. All right. Well, good morning, everyone. And thank you so much for joining us today. I have the pleasure of discussing with you all the Paycheck Protection Program, otherwise known as PPP. And more specifically, I'm going to be focusing on loan forgiveness. And of course, before we get too far into this, I do have to make a quick disclaimer. For anyone that has been following the PPP program, you know that it is constantly and pretty frustratingly evolving. And within the last week, we've had some key provisions that were amended by the PPP Flexibility Act. And then this past Monday, we had the Treasury Secretary Mnuchin and the SBA Administrator Carranza issue a joint statement indicating that they are going to be promptly issuing some additional rules and guidance, along with a modified borrower application form and a modified loan forgiveness application. So we are monitoring for those documents and that additional guidance to come out. So of course, everything that we discussed today is subject to all of that and could change rather quickly. So with that said, I'm still happy to give you guys a brief overview of how we got here with PPP, and then just to get you guys up to speed on where things currently stand regarding calculation of loan forgiveness and the forgiveness application process. So a little less than 3 months ago, the CARES Act was signed into law, and the PPP program was an important piece of that legislation. that was designed to provide small businesses and nonprofits with low interest and possibly completely forgivable loans to keep those businesses, in continued operations as the country moved forward to reopening and to keep employees on payroll. And the first round of funding was a record $349 billion, and that was exhausted in a matter of a couple of weeks. And so shortly after that, we had Congress authorizing a second round of funding, which was another $310 billion. And then as of last Thursday, the SBA gave some updated numbers on where things stand, and approximately 4.5 million PPP loans have been made, totaling about $511 billion. And so this means that there's more than $100 billion that's still available. And the deadline to be approved for a PPP loan is right around the corner on June 30th. So if you guys or anyone you know is thinking about applying, you should make sure you contact your bank sooner rather than later and get that process started. So for those borrowers that did get PPP loans as part of the first round of funding, they have had the money now for about 8 weeks. And that was the original forgiveness spending period. We'll talk about how that's changed with the recent amendments. But they've had those monies now for about 8 weeks, and they've been spending those with the goal of maximizing the amount of forgiveness that they're going to receive. Or maybe they haven't been spending it because they can't, or they've been waiting on further guidance. And so while we still have a lot of unanswered questions, we do have now some additional guidance and clarity from the SBA on how we calculate forgiveness, and I just wanted to spend some time highlighting that today. So Micah, if we want to forward, there we go. So first and foremost, there are two types of expenses that are eligible for forgiveness, and the first are payroll costs, and then the second are certain non-payroll costs. And payroll costs that are eligible for forgiveness are going to be those that are paid and those that are incurred during the applicable period. And I will discuss in a little bit what the covered periods are, but the SBA has been kind enough to tell us that payroll costs are going to be considered to be paid on the day that on the day that paychecks are distributed, and on the day that a borrower originates an ACH credit transaction. And then payroll costs are considered to be incurred on the day that the employee's pay is earned. And then to take it even a step further, we know that payroll costs that are incurred but not necessarily paid during the borrower's last pay period of its 8 or 24-week forgiveness period are still going to be eligible for forgiveness as long as they're paid on or before the next regular payroll date, even though that payroll date may occur after the covered period. So these distinctions are important because based on the language of the CARES Act, it was originally thought that in order to be eligible for forgiveness, payroll costs would have to be both incurred and paid during that 8-week or now 24-week window, which would have really limited the eligible costs. But now essentially with these distinctions from the SBA and additional clarifications, we see that a greater amount of payroll costs are going to be eligible for forgiveness, which should be a welcome benefit for a lot of borrowers. Moving on to the next slide, as I noted, only those payroll costs that are paid or incurred during the applicable forgiveness period are eligible for forgiveness. And originally that covered period was an 8-week period that began on the date that the loan proceeds were dispersed. But with the new amendments that just passed, this 8-week period has been tripled to a 24-week period, but can't go out any later than December 31st of 2020. So again, this is another welcome change for many borrowers, especially those in the restaurant and hospitality industries, for example, who haven't been able to fully reopen because of safer at home orders and phased state openings. And so therefore they've not been able to pay employees and they couldn't spend their money within the original 8-week period. But I do want to note that borrowers that did receive their loans prior to the June 5th amendment can still elect to keep the 8-week period, and they're not required to use the new 24-week period. One question that we are hoping to get an answer on from the SBA is whether borrowers are able to choose some period in between that 8 and 24 weeks. So we're hearing from a lot of borrowers that say, well, if 8 weeks was too short, 24 weeks is too long. And so instead they're estimating that maybe they're able to spend their loan funds in 16 weeks and are wondering if they're still going to be able to apply for forgiveness at the end of that 16-week period, or if they're going to have to wait until the end of 24 weeks, if that's what they go with. So again, there's not a clear answer to that. This is a new development, but we know a lot of people are asking this question, and so we're expecting to see the SBA issue some additional guidance on this point. And then on another side note, the SBA did previously establish an alternative payroll covered period for borrowers that have a biweekly or more frequent payroll schedule. And it's not clear to us whether this alternative period is going to remain or is going to be changed in any way as a result of the recent amendments. So we're also looking for additional guidance from the SBA on that. Next slide, Micah. So now that we've established the time period during which you have to spend the money, the question is what types of payroll costs can be paid and forgiven. And so I've got a slide up here which identifies the compensation to employees that is and that is not included. And I won't read each of them off, but do know that those include both cash compensation and then certain non-cash benefits. And we know that this is a source of a lot of questions as well that still have not been answered by the SBA. For example, do premiums for dental and vision insurance qualify as employee benefits that consist of group health care coverage and are included? And do non-tax qualified retirement plans qualify under retirement? Next slide. So while these and some other important questions remain unanswered, the SBA was helpful and did clarify that bonuses and hazard pay are eligible for forgiveness. And that's so long as the employee's total cash compensation does not exceed $100,000 annually, prorated during that covered period, so the 8 weeks or the 24 weeks. And then very importantly, with this recent amendment, the SBA lowered the threshold for the percentage of loan proceeds that must be spent on payroll costs in order to be eligible for forgiveness. So previously that threshold was 75%. However, many borrowers noted that their operating costs exceed their payroll costs, and that if they're limited by how much they can spend on these operating costs, then they're just not going to be able to stay in business and they're not going to have any employees to pay. So they expressed the need for some more flexibility in how they use the proceeds. And then in response to that, we saw the SBA lowering the payroll cost threshold to 60%. So if a borrower does use less than the 60% for payroll costs, then they will still be eligible for partial loan forgiveness, subject to at least 60% of the loan forgiveness amount having been issued for payroll costs. And again, this coupled with the extended spending period of 24 weeks should provide some needed relief for borrowers so that they can hopefully maximize their loan forgiveness. Moving on to operating costs. So I mentioned earlier operating costs. There are certain non-payroll costs that can be paid with PPP money and still be eligible for forgiveness. There we go, Michael, thanks. So much like payroll costs, the non-payroll costs must be paid during the covered period or must be incurred during the covered period and then paid on or before the next regular billing date, even if that billing date is going to be after the covered period. So Micah, if you don't mind going back 1, 2, there we go. So here we've provided an example using an electric bill, which is typically paid in arrears. And this example is going to be helpful in just demonstrating for you folks how a greater amount of non-payroll costs are also now going to be eligible for forgiveness than what was originally thought. Next slide. And then the period during which a non-payroll cost must be paid or incurred is the 24-week period, beginning on the date that the loan proceeds were dispersed to a borrower. Again, in no event later than December 31st. And then also, again, that borrowers who did receive their loans prior to June 5th can elect to keep the 8-week period. So Mike, I think we can move ahead one more. So there are 3 different categories of non-payroll costs that are eligible for forgiveness. This first slide here highlights 2 of them. The first are payments of interest on any business mortgage, and that includes real or personal property incurred before February 15th, 2020. Importantly, this does not include prepayments of interest or any payments of principal. So if PPP funds are used for those items, they will not be eligible for forgiveness. And then the second category of non-payroll costs that are eligible for forgiveness are business rent or lease payments. And those have to be pursuant to a lease agreement for real or personal property in force before February 15th, 2020. Next slide. And then the third category, we've got business payments for utilities. So that's going to be for electricity, gas, water, transportation, telephone, or internet, again, for which service began before February 15th, 2020. It's important to note that these non-payroll costs cannot exceed now 40%. It used to be 25%, now it's 40% of the total forgiveness amount. So in other words, if we've got any amount over 40% of the loan proceeds spent on these non-payroll items, that amount over 40% will not be forgiven. And then additionally, I wanted to note that as part of your forgiveness application, you're going to be required to provide documentation that verifies that these obligations were in place as of February 15th, 2020. So copies of lease agreements, mortgage lender account statements, copies of utility invoices. So you'll need all of that to show that those were in place and obligations before February 15th. And then you'll need the documentation to show that you then paid those during the 24 or 8-week covered periods. So we are suggesting that by borrowers begin compiling all those documents now so that those are readily available when it comes time to complete the forgiveness application. So you've spent all of your money on payroll and non-payroll items that we just discussed. You did so in your 8 or 24-week time period. You met the 60%, 40% threshold. You're clear, right? You're going to get 100% forgiveness. Well, maybe not, because there are a couple of ways that your loan forgiveness can be reduced. And so here I've outlined generally that the amount of loan forgiveness is going to be reduced if the number of full-time equivalent employees is reduced, and that's referred to as the FTE reduction, or if individual employees' salaries or hourly wages are reduced by more than 25%. And this is referred to as the salary hourly wage reduction. And before we dive into those 2 components of reduction, I want to highlight that the SBA has told us that there are two methods for calculating an FTE, and we've provided those two options in this slide, which are essentially based off of a 40-hour work week. So borrowers may select one of these two methods and then must apply that method consistently when calculating FTEs. But all hope is not lost if you do find out after running these calculations that you have one or both of these reductions, because there are safe harbors and exemptions that a borrower may qualify for, and we will get into those as well. So next slide. So let's start with the FTE reduction. A borrower's loan forgiveness will be reduced if the borrower's average number of FTEs during its covered period, again, the age of 24 weeks, is less than the average number of FTEs during the borrower's chosen reference period. And you'll see here we've provided what those reference periods are. Borrowers can choose between a couple of different reference periods. The first is February 15th, 2019 to June 30th, 2019. The second is January 1st, 2020 to February 29th, 2020. Or for seasonal employers, they can choose either of those preceding periods, or they can choose a consecutive 12-week period between May 1st, 2019 and September 15th, 2019. But the same reference period must be used for each employee. So borrowers will want to run the numbers using all of the applicable reference periods, and then we'll just obviously want to choose the one that results in the lesser amount, as that is going to be the amount that's going to reduce loan forgiveness. And the basic premise here is that the average number of FTEs during your covered period is going to reduce the amount of forgiveness proportionally by the percentage of the reduction in FTEs. And so one example of this is that if you had, 10 FTEs between February 15th, 2019 and June 30th, 2019, but then you only had 8 FTEs during your 8-week forgiveness spending period, and you don't qualify for any exemptions or the safe harbor, then the amount of your forgiveness is going to be reduced by 20%, the reduction. However, there are a few exemptions to the FTE reduction calculations, meaning that any reductions in workforce in these contexts are not going to reduce the borrower's loan forgiveness. So this slide right here highlights one situation where an employee rejects the employer's offer to rehire or restore hours. It's very important to make sure that all of these conditions are met and documented in order to be able to take advantage of this exemption. Next slide. And then this slide highlights some of the other scenarios, including, for example, if a borrower fires an employee for cause, or if an employee voluntarily resigns, or an employee requests and receives a reduction in their hours during the time that you're spending your PPP funds. And again, these are just more examples of how the most recent guidance and set of amendments have provided borrowers with some additional flexibility and some additional relief to hopefully maximize loan forgiveness, especially in circumstances that are completely out of the borrower's control. Next slide. And then finally, this slide just outlines the safe harbor. This is where if a borrower reduced its FTE employee levels between February 15th and April 26th of 2020, and then it restores those levels by no later than December 31st to the levels that it was at compared to February 15th. If it does that, then the safe harbor applies, and those prior FTE reductions during that earlier period will not reduce the amount that is eligible for forgiveness. Next slide. Okay. And you can go one more. All right, so as I mentioned earlier, a borrower's loan forgiveness amount will also be reduced if there's a salary hourly wage reduction. This is only applicable to employees who earned $100,000 or less in 2019 or who are not employed by the borrower in 2019. And then it's also important to note that the $100,000 is calculated per each pay period. So in this case, a borrower's loan forgiveness amount is going to be reduced for each of those employees whose average pay, whether that be salary or hourly wage, during the cover period, so the 8 or 24 weeks that you're spending the money, if that is less than 75% of what their average pay was for the period from January 1st, 2020 to March 31st, 2020. And so again, the basic premise here is that the total amount of forgiveness is going to be reduced by the total dollar amount of salary or wage reduction that is in excess of 25% of the salary or wages between that January 1st and March 31st, 2020 time period. And this reduction calculation is done on a per employee basis and is not done in the aggregate. Next slide. And again, here we've got a safe harbor that borrowers could qualify for. And so I've outlined the two situations in which the safe harbor could apply. So if the average annual salary or hourly wages between February 15th and April 26th of 2020 is equal to or greater than the annual salary or hourly wages as of February 15th, or if the average annual salary or hourly wage as of December 31st is restored to an amount that's equal to or greater than that average salary or wage as of February 15th, then the safe harbor does apply and you won't have to worry about a forgiveness reduction. So as we've gone through all that, you can see there are quite a few key timelines that we need to keep track of. There's a lot of calculations, there's a lot of alternative calculations that the borrower is going to be running through in connection with its application for loan forgiveness. And so it's important for borrowers to be prepared going into that application process, to understand the timing and to have all of its documentation in order and at its fingertips. So here, just kind of quickly running through the timeline of the loan forgiveness application process. So just like the loan application on the front end, the forgiveness process starts with the borrower's lender. So after the borrower's covered period, whether that be 8 or 24 weeks, has expired, then the borrower can go to its lender and submit a request for loan forgiveness. And this is going to be done via a loan forgiveness application. And then there are also supporting documents that I will discuss in a couple of minutes. After the borrower submits a complete application for forgiveness, then the lender is going to have 60 days to review that application and then submit its decision on forgiveness to the SBA. And then the lender at that same time is also going to be requesting that the SBA remit to it payment of the forgiveness amount. And so once the SBA receives that correspondence from the lender, it will, subject to any SBA review of the loan or the loan application, it will have up to 90 days to remit the forgiveness payment to the lender. So to really break this process down, I mean, it's going to take up to 5 months from the date that the application is submitted to the lender, and will likely take longer if there is an SBA review of the loan or the loan application. Next slide. And then any amounts that are not forgiven as part of this process are going to be repaid in accordance with the terms of the borrower's PPP loan documents that it's signed with its lender. And prior to the most recent set of amendments that came out, that payment was deferred for 6 months. However, I think the SBA realized that the timing was a little off with a at least 5-month review. So they changed the deferral period to be payments of principal, interest, and fees now not due until the date that the lender receives the forgiveness payment and has a better understanding of where forgiveness stands from the SBA. So the SBA has also contemplated that there may be some borrowers that opt not to request forgiveness or are a little delayed in doing so. And so for those borrowers that fail to apply for loan forgiveness within 10 months of the expiration of their covered period, they will then be required to start paying back their loan at that time, at the 10-month mark. And then further, loans that are made after June 5th will have a 5-year maturity date. You probably remember that existing loans have a 2-year maturity date. That's still the case. However, the SBA has said that the borrower and its lender can go back and mutually agree to modify the existing 2-year maturity date to the 5-year maturity date. Thanks. So there are several documents that are required as part of the loan forgiveness process. These are the loan forgiveness application, and that application can be found at the Treasury's website. For those of you who haven't been there, I do recommend that you go to www.treasury.gov. That website has all of the documentation, all of the SBA frequently asked questions, all of the interim final rules that have been issued, and that's a good resource to continue to monitor as things continue to change. And again, we are waiting for an updated loan forgiveness application per the SBA's promise to issue that to meet what the new amendments say. Next. And then currently, the current page 10 of the loan forgiveness application breaks down the payroll and the FTE verification documents that are going to be required to be submitted. So we've outlined those on this slide. And then on the next slide, we have outlined the non-payroll verification documents that are going to be required. And then on our next slide, there is a list of documentation that is required to be maintained, but not submitted with the loan application. So it's still important to make sure that your files have all of these documents. And then, as the next slide highlights, it is important for borrowers to note that they are required to retain all of this documentation for 6 years after the date the loan is forgiven or repaid in full. And the borrowers are also required to give the SBA and the Office of Inspector General access to all of these records if requested. Next slide. And then the next one, Micah, thanks. So earlier I made some references to the SBA review. The SBA does have broad review authority. And first and foremost, the borrower together with its affiliates, if they receive PPP funds in an original principal amount in excess of $2 million, we have heard that the SBA, we've all heard it, the SBA is going to audit those loans and the loan forgiveness applications that are submitted in connection with those loans. The SBA has also decided that it is going to, in its discretion, audit any PPP loans of any size at any time, regardless of whether a forgiveness application has been submitted. So it's gone ahead and reserved its right to do that. And then it's also possible for a loan to be audited after it has been forgiven or repaid in full. And I think, again, that's why it's important, going back to this requirement, that borrowers maintain all of their documents for 6 years to make sure that that is readily available if requested. And then in the course of its review, the SBA can go back. They can review a borrower's eligibility for the loan. They can review the loan amounts. They can review the use of the proceeds and the loan forgiveness amounts. And then if the SBA ends up determining that the borrower was originally ineligible for the loan, or for the loan amount obtained, or for the loan forgiveness amount that was claimed. They will be able to direct the lender to deny the loan forgiveness application in full or in part. They could seek repayment of the outstanding loan balance, and then they could also pursue other available remedies. So really, to sum all of this up, we appreciate, as do all of you, that this is a lot of information and that all of this continues to rapidly change and develop. And so that is why we are just highly encouraging everyone to continue to stay informed, monitor that Treasury's website that I mentioned for all the updates, continue to keep in contact with your partners, your attorneys, your accountants, your third-party payroll providers, and especially the bank that made your PPP loan. Because at the end of the day, the bank is the one that's going to be reviewing the application, making the forgiveness determination. And so it's really important to understand what policies and procedures the bank's going to be putting in place with respect to loan forgiveness, so that borrowers can fully and efficiently comply with those and hopefully maximize the loan forgiveness. And so with that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to hand it over to Wendy, but I'll continue to monitor the chat room. And once all of the presentations are done, I'm happy to jump back in and answer any PPP questions that come in. Thanks.
Thanks, Jessica.
Yeah.
Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Well, we're going to shift gears a little bit and turn away from all the PPP and CARES Act issues and turn our focus now to the retail restaurant environment, the landlord tenant issues, retail or customer issues that we're all have already seen and are expecting to see in the future, and kind of and talk about some guidance or best practice recommendations for how to move forward. It's no big surprise, I'm sure, to all of you that these governmentally mandated closures have, absolutely had a devastating impact on retail and restaurant uses, hotel uses, anything having to do with the general public. Being required to close for business has meant tenants aren't making sales, and so they're not able to make their rent. Landlords aren't collecting the rent like they normally are, and then they're not able in turn to meet their mortgage obligations. And so it really has created a huge financial bind in this whole sector. As a practical matter, most commercial leases do not allow a tenant to provide that a tenant can abate rent due to an event of force majeure, which is, a circumstance outside of everyone's control. Clearly, a pandemic would, fit that definition. But because the lease documents typically say you still have to pay rent, there's really not any clear-cut answers in the lease to try to help all of us understand what's the right way to address this. And many tenants have just not paid rent starting in April because they haven't been open for business. And the result is we're just having to have conversations. Landlords and tenants are having to have some conversations and trying to figure this out. As written, for the most part, commercial leases are much more favorable to a landlord. It allows, you to delay your performance of certain obligations under the lease, like a construction time frame or being required to be open and operating. But like I said, it doesn't necessarily excuse any payment for rent. So what I've been seeing and working with a lot of both tenants and landlords is, you're just having to have conversations. The landlords and tenants are having conversations about how we're going to do this. How can we create some breathing room in the short term to allow the tenant to get through this crisis situation and then remain viable over the long term. And we're still somewhat early in the game, but kind of what I've been seeing typically is some form of rent deferment or rent abatement, maybe for about 3 months. And then depending on things like how much term is left in the lease, maybe we extend some term to allow the landlord to recoup at the back end. Or we, say we'll repay the deferred rent over 12 months starting in January, things like that, just to try to help everybody get through this. One of the things that I like about this approach is that, there's so many uncertainties right now about what's happening. And if we can get some kind of an agreement in place, then we can at least create some certainty around what this is going to look like as far as the rental obligation. So that way a landlord knows when they can expect their money. A tenant knows, okay, I have this much breathing room. I can conserve my cash for this amount of time and figure out, how to go forward, what's going to work. Being able to get, PPP loan proceeds, have time to do those types of things. So I think that's an important thing to do if we, it allows landlords and tenants to sort of partner together and try to get through this, which I think in the long run helps everybody, because if you're a landlord, it means you're giving your tenant a chance to stay viable. And if you're continue to pay rent over the long term, and it allows a tenant to get through this very difficult situation and keep their business intact. It's interesting though, because we are starting to see lawsuits that have already started to crop up in the mostly retail industry. I've been watching, there's a case. So Simon, one of the largest shopping center developers in the country, has sued the Gap for not paying rent and has taken a pretty aggressive position on this. Probably the case will settle, but certainly if the Gap were to be successful in this, that would probably create a good, that will embolden tenants then to take the position, well, I don't need to pay you rent because of this situation. If Simon prevails, then obviously we'll send a message to tenants that we're not going to win on this. So it'll be interesting to see how that all goes. Another developer in Florida has sued AMC and Ross, and trying to get all the rent. And we'll see how that all goes. It's still very early, so I don't, we're kind of keeping an eye on that to see how these cases will turn out. And then on the flip side, we have there's a case in New York City where a art gallery owner actually sued their landlord, saying that the pandemic has given them the ability to terminate their lease because they can no longer do what they intended to do in the space, which is to have large gallery openings with large crowds. So, leasing law is not a particularly dynamic area. And all of a sudden, in the 25 years I've been doing this, now all of a sudden there's going to be maybe new case law that is going to change the landscape a bit. But it'll probably be a couple of years before we know exactly how all that is going to play out. In terms of moving forward with how do we operate in this new environment now that things are starting to reopen, what are the best practices or recommendations that we would say you should consider? Obviously we need to all observe any capacity restrictions that might be in effect, which I know is making it particularly challenging for restaurant operators, since restaurants are designed to operate at maximum capacity to be profitable. And when you limit that, you put a restaurant operator in a position where it's really difficult for them to be open in this limited format and still be able to make any money. Another thing obviously is to make sure you have safety protocols in place. A lot of people have put plexiglass in front of registers, and they have PPE for their employees. All of these types of things I think some of it hopefully is protecting employees and customers as they're in the store, and gives a comfort level, but I think it sends a strong message that you're taking this seriously. You want to create a safe environment for your customers so that they will then return to your business. Obviously we have cleaning protocols now that we didn't have before, with sanitizing surfaces, maybe even having to clean duct systems. And there's extra costs related to those as well, which have to be considered. And trying to make sure that you have protocols for your employees where you take your temperature before you come to work, and anytime if they have any symptoms, they not come to work. Maintaining contact tracing logs for your employees, and all of that has to be done in a way that you respect HIPAA privacy requirements, so that the identity of anybody who might be in this situation is not revealed. I think it's a good idea for landlords to have a kind of a open communication system to communicate their safety protocols with tenants and visitors of their buildings and their properties. making everybody aware of what the plan is, so that again people feel more comfortable about being there, and have a confidence level that if there were an issue, it would be addressed like it needs to be. So for landlords and tenants, taking a look at your operating costs provisions of your leases to try to determine to what extent, if any, you can, if you're a landlord, pass through these additional costs associated with cleaning to your tenants. Tenants obviously want to see, like, is there any limitation regarding to that cost, so that you don't encounter a huge spike in your operating costs as a result. Certainly, I think we are going to see, though, a big change in what that cost item looked like previously, in light of all the enhanced cleaning that needs to be done. Also, the rules and regulations under a lease provision, where landlords are able to require certain things to be done by different tenants and occupants of their property, making sure that you have the right regulations, rules in effect to make sure that you are all following that. Taking a look at your maintenance requirements under your lease. If you're the landlord, if you're required to maintain in compliance with law, or in compliance, in a first-class condition, you want to make sure that you're doing that. Otherwise, you may open yourself to liability for a breach of that duty. And then I wanted to talk briefly about hotel operators, just because that use, I know that there are some hotels in the PID, and some unique things because of that use that need to be addressed. I know, most hotels have been moving to, reducing the amenities offered in order to reduce contact between people. So bellhop, valet services, no breakfast buffet, no spa services, offering online check-in with, the key to get into an app to use instead of an actual key to get into the room. I think communicating what your cleaning protocol is. The common areas are being sanitized and elevators are being cleaned on a regular basis, in addition to probably enhanced cleaning procedures for the individual rooms. Installing, this would be retail or hotel, those 6-foot markers throughout your common areas, just trying to keep people mindful of the social distancing requirements. And I know, some hotels are looking at new innovative processes to try to accomplish this. Hilton is currently working with the Mayo Clinic's infection prevention control team to try to figure out how to use electrostatic sprayers, which can uniformly disinfect large areas, and also like ultraviolet light to sanitize surfaces and objects. And certainly this is something that not just hotels might consider using, that would be applicable potentially to restaurant or retail operations as well. I did want to give a shout out. I don't know if they're on the call, but the South Congress Hotel, I know they had they did have a positive COVID-19 situation with an employee, and this is a screenshot of what the message that they put out on social media, which I thought was really well done, because it tells it gives the information that the general public would want to know. I think it says, we had a positive. This is the date it occurred. This was the last date the person was in the restaurant. They were in, not a customer-facing role. And, so it kind of helped everybody understand, like, okay, I've been there recently, but my risk probably wasn't that high. Like, I feel like they did a really good job of communicating what had happened, addressing kind of their response in terms of what they were doing to ensure extra safety, stopping their food and beverage, things like that, and giving the time frame so that, if you'd been there in early May, you're like, okay, that was before I was there before that happened, or after, but I wasn't anywhere near the food and beverage, things like that. So I think that was a really good way to communicate that, to answer questions and proactively show that you have addressed the concerns. And the reason they were able to do that, I'm sure, is because they sat down, they had a plan already in place before this happened, and then they just, were able to just implement that plan from a communication and action standpoint. So I think that, having those plans in place and being ready to act on them if it is to happen is definitely critical to being able to, address these in a way that is going to minimize any impact to your business. And then the one thing that we're all thinking about now, because really this is pretty unprecedented, and that is, what if there's a second wave, or what if there's, another future pandemic? How do I make sure I'm positioned to be able to get through this better another time than I have been this time? And there probably aren't any magic bullets to make sure that you're completely 100% protected in the future, but I do think that there are a lot of provisions of your leases, if you're a tenant or a landlord, that you would want to consider looking at and potentially revising or beefing up to try to allow for a better way to figure out what happens next. Because part of the difficulty of this situation is that the leases really didn't contemplate this kind of a situation, and so we've all had to kind of figure it out as we go along, which has made it more difficult, created more uncertainty, and probably more financial hardship than it would have if we had proactively had some language in the lease to say, if this happens and I'm closed for business for X amount of time and there's no insurance proceeds available, then if it's more than 30 days, I can abate 50% of my rent for 4 months, or whatever that solution is. If you do something like that, then everybody just kind of knows this is how we're going to handle it, and you don't have all that back and forth and trying to figure it out when it actually happens. So, if you have any leases that you would like, us to look at, whether as a tenant or a landlord, to try to develop some recommendations as to how you could be better prepared going, with your leasing or your contracts going forward. And this, I think also translates to vendor contracts, any third-party contracts that you have. You probably want to take a look and see what it says now, and maybe try to identify some opportunities in your next go round to try to tighten that up and give yourself better protection in the future. And then if there's any questions, I'm happy to try to answer at the end as well. And I will turn over to Eric now.
There you go.
You can hear me now? Great. I was saying that I'm coming to you here from Milwaukee. Yesterday was Taco Tuesday, and we had some tacos at our house just outside of Milwaukee, and they were not good. They were not good. So what I'm saying is I'm with you in Austin in spirit, if not in person. I'm jealous of your delicious tacos. But that's not what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about some employment law aspects of the COVID-19 pandemic that we're dealing with. I'm the chair of the firm's National Labor and Employment Practice, and the last couple of months have been very interesting ones for us as we're advising clients on transition out of the workplace to work from home, and now transition back. And what I wanted to highlight today for you guys very briefly were some of the different theories of liability that employers need to be aware of, and risks about possible claims from employees. So that employer-employee relationship, and some things that you can do to mitigate your risk and to be aware of. So we'll move to the next slide. As employees are coming back to the workplace, we have here on the slide, it's likely that legal claims are going to start to rise. We've actually already seen that. We've seen an increase in litigation, specifically claims about failure to pay, employee retaliation, and wrongful termination claims. We are expecting these claims to expand, and want you to be aware of what those various different claims could be. I know most of you on the call here have employees. So I'll start with workers' compensation. This is the primary area where an employer has liability, potential liability here in connection with COVID-19 exposure. I'll start by noting that Texas, as you guys will know, is a unique state. Most states have an exclusive workers' compensation framework in place, which provides that virtually all claims that an employee might have against her employer go through the workers' comp process. Texas, as you know, actually has a bifurcated process where the employer has the ability to opt in to that workers' compensation statute. If you opt in, then the analysis is going to be similar to what I'm talking about here today. If you opt out, then it'll be a more traditional negligence analysis. But I'll analyze this again under the sort of the traditional workers' comp framework. these elements that we've got here up on the slide are those elements, right? So in order to bring a claim, an individual has to demonstrate that they've sustained an accident or contracted an occupational disease, that the disease in this case arose out of or occurred during the course of employment, and that there's a causal relationship between the accident and the resulting injury. So those last two elements are the tricky ones when we talk about COVID cases, right? Can an employee, and the burden is typically on the employee here, demonstrate that if they catch the virus, that they were exposed or caught that while they were performing their services at work? Different states have dealt with this in different ways. Some states have created presumptions. California, for instance, is maybe on one end of the spectrum, said that essentially they've shifted this burden, and that an employee who is tested positive for COVID within a specific period of time, about 3 days after working, at least 3 days within their last work shift, is presumed to have contracted that case at work, and that it becomes a compensable injury. Other states are sort of giving that presumption to frontline healthcare workers or first responders, but not to other employees. Texas is in the middle at this point. So ultimately, the burden is going to be on the employee to demonstrate that he or she contracted that virus. So the bad news is for employers is that I think that we are going to start to see a shift where it was going to be easier for employees to make the case that their COVID case is compensable under the workers' compensation framework. I think there's going to be a trend towards employees being able to make that causal connection. The good news, however, is that if we're operating under this workers' compensation framework, as you may know, damages are limited. There's going to be a damage cap under the statute. The employee's medical costs are going to be covered, but there's not going to be the ability for compensatory or punitive damages, which is where the big liability risk would come in. Again, the asterisk for us here when we're talking about Texas, this is sort of the framework that applies if you were an employer who opts into the workers' comp system. Next slide. The other area you're hearing a fair amount about these days is OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health Administration. There have been a substantial increase in complaints that employees have filed with OSHA, alleging that their employers have done enough to provide a safe a safe workplace for them in terms of COVID exposure. Interestingly, there is not a specific standard that OSHA has issued on COVID-19. There have been a number of requests that OSHA do something like that. There was a lawsuit from the international organization of the AFL-CIO union seeking an issuance of that standard. The House of Representatives passed an act directing OSHA to do that, but the acting OSHA administrator has come out and said that there is not a current intent for the agency to issue a standard. So it is unlikely that we are going to see OSHA creating specific guidance for employers. So where does that leave us when we talk about safety in the workplace? OSHA does have a general duty clause, which requires employers to furnish employment and a place of employment free from recognized hazards that are likely to cause death or serious physical harm. So to the extent employees are making claims, this is where we might see OSHA investigating and issuing potential citations. This concept of, well, did you as the employer take sufficient steps to address the risk or mitigate the risk? And Wendy talked a little bit about that at the end of her section just previous to mine. The things like enforcing social distancing, providing masks or face coverings, re-engineering the workplace so that we can limit exposure of employees to customers or third parties. Those are all things that you could do as an employer to help push back if an employee alleged, hey, I think that there's a workplace safety issue. Next slide. Another theory of liability here would be a theory of negligence. As I mentioned up top, employees are typically going to be limited to bringing a workers' compensation claim against their employer. But again, in Texas, if you've opted out of the workers' comp system, you're not a subscribing employer, then that claim would be analyzed under a theory of negligence. And I want to make a point here. Something that we've heard a lot in the news is there seems to be sort of this general conception that, well, I have a risk because if an employee or a customer says they contracted COVID as a result of an exposure at my place of business, then I'm at risk, or I'm going to be liable. This is not a strict liability standard. So even if somebody contracts the virus at your place of business, there still needs to be this legal analysis that's performed. And the elements there are what I've got outlined. First, the employer or the business owner owed a duty to protect that individual from COVID-19 exposure. Two, that the employer breached that duty by failing to maintain proper precautions. And then three, there's a causal connection between the breach and the individual contracting that virus. So essentially, if you are taking steps that are, if we think about benchmarking, in line with what your other peers are in your industry, you know, we're increasing our cleanings, we're enforcing social distancing, we're installing plexiglass barriers. If an individual contracts the virus, notwithstanding those efforts, and then brings a negligence claim against you, you're going to have a strong defense, because maybe we had a duty to protect the employee or the third party, but if we've taken steps, if we've acted reasonably, that individual is not going to be able to demonstrate that we've breached our duty or that we've acted with negligence in that instance. So that's why these investments and steps you're taking are especially important. You've heard some discussion about possible legislation that would grant an additional level of protection that would limit liability for businesses, you know, from these sort of claims, either by employees or by third parties. I'm not sure where that's going to go. I think that at the state level, we might see some of that happen. At the federal level, there's been strong pushback against that by the Democrats in the House of Representatives. So I think we don't know for sure where that will end up. But ultimately, you know, even if we continue to operate in the current framework, there is a defense against these sort of claims if you can show that you acted reasonably. Next slide. Whistleblower retaliation claims. We've seen a substantial increase in claims that have been filed by employees who believe that they were terminated or had employment action taken against them after raising concerns about exposure to COVID-19. So the elements of this claim is an employee who brings a legitimate complaint or concern regarding safety, and that the employee then was disciplined or terminated as a result of those complaints. There's a lot of different sort of legal frameworks where these things can come up. I mentioned the Occupational Safety and Health Act is one. ADA claims, claims under the new Families First Coronavirus Response Act. So these are those leave rights there. The National Labor Relations Act, which I'll talk about on the next slide here in just a moment. And then finally, some general state public policy claims. But the recommendation or advice here is that if you have an individual who's raising concerns, raising safety concerns, even if you feel like those concerns are not legitimate, you're saying to yourself, listen, we've taken these steps to make sure that it's a safe workplace. You know, we're following the laws and the rules as best we can. My advice is that when an employee raises a concern, that we process that as we would, you know, any other bona fide concern, even if we don't believe ultimately that there's merit to that complaint. So we want to show that we took it seriously and that we handled or addressed any concerns. And then second, that we be extra careful if somebody raises a concern like that, that we don't create a presumption that then we're retaliating against somebody who, you know, terminating somebody because they raised that complaint. Just because someone is a whistleblower doesn't mean that they're prevented from, we're prevented from taking otherwise legitimate employment action. But I think it's beneficial to just be thoughtful about the background before we take that next step. Next slide. Unfair labor practices under the National Labor Relations Act. I mentioned this briefly on the previous slide. What I want to just point out here is that the NLRA, the federal labor law, applies not only to unionized workforces but also non-union employers. And essentially, the relevance here is that the NLRA, you know, protects employees who are engaged in concerted protected activity. And what that can include is walkouts or sickouts in response to alleged COVID-19 safety or exposure concerns. So if you've got, you know, on our previous slide, I was talking about this whistleblower retaliation piece. That's something to be aware of if you've got an individual who's raising these concerns on her behalf. But here, if you've got a group of employees who are raising these concerns, there is a risk that if we take action against that group, that we could be violating this federal labor law and be on the receiving end of an unfair labor practice, even if we are a non-union workplace. The area where this comes up that I think is sometimes interesting is you might have employees who are posting comments on social media or even creating their own Facebook group where they're saying, listen, my employer is not providing me with a safe environment. We should tread carefully before we take action against individuals who are doing that sort of online communication, even if it would appear to be a violation of the policies that we have in our employee handbook. Because there have been cases that suggest that groups of employees raising legitimate concerns on social media is this sort of protected activity. So again, if they're engaging in communications that are abusive or otherwise sort of offensive, we're likely going to have the right to take action. But if it's just employees raising concerns, let's think twice before we aggressively respond so that we don't create additional liability. Next slide. The Fair Labor Standards Act. This is the federal law that requires us to track and compensate employees correctly. There are a couple different litigation risks that we've seen come up, particularly in the context of the pandemic. The first is tracking hours and overtime for remote, non-exempt employees. So to the extent that you have moved some of your jobs off-site and have been allowing employees to work from home or work remotely, if those positions are for salaried employees, then we obviously do not have an obligation to specifically track time or pay overtime. But many businesses have been having individuals who are hourly employees do this remote work. And if they are, we need to make sure that we have a robust system in place that allows us to track the time that's working and pay overtime if appropriate. We are going to see a substantial explosion of claims in non-exempt hourly employees who were asked to be working remotely over the last couple months. And they're going to come back and say, well, I ended up working 60 hours in a given week rather than 40, and now my employer is refusing to pay me. So that's something to have on your radar screen. FLSA considerations and salary reductions. Some businesses, as they were trying to manage the economic impact of the pandemic, were moving employees from a salaried or exempt status to a hourly non-exempt status so that they could reduce hours. That's generally acceptable and allowable. But if you do that, again, you need to make sure that we were tracking time, tracking overtime, and following the rules there. And then finally, this concept of the use of PTO or vacation time in the furlough or layoff process. What the applicable rules are and how we manage that, something to be aware of. Next slide. The final section I've got here is potential third-party claims. I've alluded to this before. Most of the ones that I've talked about so far are the sort of claims that an employee might bring against her employer. There is also the possibility that we businesses could face lawsuits by customers or visitors alleging that the business acted negligently or exposed these individuals. As I mentioned before, the framework that is typically going to operate here is this concept of negligence. And so, in order to prove this, a business is going to have to, a plaintiff is going to have to allege that we as the business knew or should have known that we created a risk of exposure and that we failed to take sufficient action. The big example of these sort of cases are the claims that are already been filed against the cruise ships who were operating at the beginning of the pandemic. And the claim is that the cruise operators should have been aware of these risks and ultimately didn't take appropriate steps. As I mentioned before, your best defense here is going to show that you've taken steps to increase cleaning, enforce social distancing, all of those good things that Wendy mentioned. So I believe that is the end of my section of the presentation, and I will turn it over to Micah.
Thank you, Eric. So I know we only have a few minutes left, so I'm going to breeze through my presentation on local issues and orders and ordinances to try to save a little time for Q&A for any of the presenters at the end. You probably heard just the other day that the Texas Supreme Court declined to hear the appeal of the lower court's ruling that the paid sick leave ordinance is unconstitutional. So there's no paid sick leave ordinance that is in effect currently, and there's rumors that the state legislators will pass legislation, which we expect the governor to sign, to try to keep Austin from enacting such legislation or ordinance in the future that's tries to get around the third court's ruling. There are two main eviction orders and ordinances you should know of. These are pretty similar at the city and county level. As far as the mayor's order, there is a moratorium on issuing notices to vacate and a moratorium on seizing most property or removing a tenant's property or excluding them from the premises, subject to a few exceptions. One of those being if the tenant or their guest is posing an imminent threat of physical harm or conducting criminal activity, then that's an exception where eviction is possible. This applies to both commercial and residential tenants. It's very hard to prove imminent threat. I've had a lot of discussions with the Justice of the Peace, who's on the Supreme Court task force about this, and it's just really difficult. But if there is a problem, then there are ways to go about that. There's also a city council approved ordinance, and those provide protections both for commercial and residential tenants. And this only applies in cases of non-payment of rent, and it only applies to a tenant who's been affected by the COVID pandemic. And the extra protection there is that instead of issuing a notice to vacate, you have to issue a notice of proposed eviction that gives the tenant 2 months to respond and catch up on their payments before you can issue a notice to vacate. That ordinance goes into effect or is in effect until for any payments made through or that should have been made until August 24th. And so obviously 23rd, you're still going through another 60 days before you can actually get them forcibly removed if that's necessary. There's also a more recent mayoral order. It has several parts to it. I just wanted to quickly highlight this since I know there's some restaurants on South Congress in the PID, and just want you to know, and I know some restaurants are self-disclosing when there's an incident, but the city has said that if you don't take certain precautions and take a log of patrons, which sounds pretty onerous, that the public health department may distribute information about your restaurant that there was a confirmed case there. So I just wanted to make sure that you all are aware of that. And I know you probably are, but there's just so many orders. I wanted to cover that. Governor Abbott announced just the other day that we're in phase 3 of reopening. And I know some of you probably been visited by code enforcement, not to have a citation, but they're working to educate people from what I understand. And a lot of cases where there is a violation, there's not a citation. The city's goal here is to ensure compliance as best they can. It would only be a really egregious situation from what I'm hearing where there would be a citation. And I think based on my experience and eating at Perla's the other day, these protocols are being followed. Next stage coming up on Friday is an expansion in capacity for certain restaurants and bars. Odd requirement is that at a bar, you can only serve a patron that is seated. I'll see how that works, but I guess it's to reduce clusters of people. Have not seen that adhered to outside of South Congress. Other bars I've thrown by and not stopped at. July 4th celebrations. So, you know, there's some great events that happen on South Congress. If they're under 500 people, it can proceed. The county judge, the mayor, the public health department cannot shut down a celebration of fewer than 500 people. You should still implement some health protocols, but you are allowed to do that. And the governor's order does trump the mayor's order or the county judge's order if there's a conflict. And then Eric alluded to this earlier about some pending legislation that Senator Cornyn talked about yesterday on a conference call is on, and what he is trying to do, along with Mitch McConnell, is to enact legislation that would protect employers and landlords like you from liability, as long as you're taking reasonable safeguards so that you're not subject to legal liability if somebody on the premises gets sick and then comes back in and claims that it was your fault, because that's really hard to prove. And the policy and goal is to keep the economy moving without people being so afraid of lawsuits that they just decide not to operate. These are screen grabs of the city's dashboard of cases. I do want to quickly mention, because you might have read about this morning, there was a big spike of cases reported on Monday. And I think that it's not a cause for alarm right now. You need to wait a few days to see if that trend continues. What I think is going on is there is a slight increase based on lack of social distancing at the protest, some having to do with the economy reopening, but a lot of it has to do with the fact that the public health tests, which are the ones that are counted in this dashboard, 63% of all tests since the beginning of this epidemic in Austin were the tests were over a 4-day period just the other day. And so I think it might be a testing anomaly. So we'll just have to wait and see, but I would not be too alarmed at this point. Our numbers are still good, plenty of hospital capacity. And I think, as you've seen from your own experience, people are feeling safe, and that's good for South Congress and good for all of us if we can do it safely. And so I know there was a question on chat, and so let's open it now for, I know we're about out of time, but we'll take however long y'all want to answer any questions you have. Jessica, there was a question about, do you see the question under the chat? Could you respond to that one?
Absolutely. So we've got two entries in the chat. The one is an important note, and I think is worth repeating, is that the full-time equivalent employee calculation for purposes of PPP loan forgiveness and reduction is based on the 40-hour work week and not the usual state definition of 32+ hours per week. So thank you for reiterating that. And then the other question that we've got in there right now is the forgiveness of the 40% of the PPP loan that can be spent on rent, mortgage expenses contingent on spending the full 60% of the PPP loan on payroll? For example, could a business owner just spend 40% of the PPP loan on rent and still have that amount forgiven without using any of it for payroll? And those are really good questions because this 60-40% threshold is a brand new concept and has been the subject of a lot of concern. The answer to that, I think we're going to see come out in the promised additional guidance. The reason why I'm referring to that is that the way that the PPP Flexibility Act amendment reads is that in order to receive forgiveness, a borrower must spend at least 60% of the loan proceeds on payroll costs. And that was getting a lot of attention and was one of the holdups as to why this was not passed sooner. A number of senators expressed a concern that that language could be interpreted as an all or nothing threshold, meaning that if you spent 59.9% of your PPP funds on payroll costs, you would receive zero forgiveness because you didn't meet that 60% threshold, rather than allowing for a proportional forgiveness, which was what was always understood to be the issue when we were talking 75%, 25%. So what happened was, in the recent statement that came out on Monday by the SBA and by the Treasury, what they have specifically said is that if a borrower uses less than 60% of the loan amount for payroll costs, the borrower will continue to be eligible for partial loan forgiveness. But then they've gone on to say, subject to at least 60% of the loan forgiveness amount having been used for payroll costs. So it's hard to kind of read those together and understand where they're going to go with it in the end of the day. So I think there will be a partial loan forgiveness and a sliding scale, but then this additional subjection of at least 60% of the loan forgiveness amount having been used for payroll costs suggests to me, in answer to this second part of the question, could you just spend 40% on the PPP loan on rent and nothing on payroll and receive forgiveness? The answer to that might be no, but I don't know that that's what they're intending at this point. And so that's why I think that we'll have to be on the lookout for that additional guidance, hopefully a frequently asked question by the SBA so that we can see where they are going to go with that. And then I don't see any other questions in the chat, but if you've got anyone that wants to unmute and ask a question, feel free to do that. And if not, then you guys have our contact information. You can feel free to reach out to any of us and float any questions you have by us.
A question pop up on chat. I don't know if you see that about the emergency loan grant.
Yes. So for those of you who applied for an emergency disaster loan and received the grant while you were waiting for a response on your loan, that was up to $10,000. It was based on, I think the calculation was $1,000 per employee. So with that, if you also received a PPP loan, that's fine. You can't use the proceeds of both for the same purpose. But what will happen is at the end of the day, when you're computing your loan forgiveness, that $10,000 grant or whatever other amount you may have received, up to $10,000 by way of the grant for the disaster loan, it will be taken off and will reduce the amount of your loan forgiveness. So essentially, we'll end up getting paid back via the low interest rate loan provisions. And you'll probably see that as part of the updated, I think it's in there now, but you'll also see it as part of the updated loan forgiveness application as you're working through your calculations. I think one of the last lines is for you to input whether or not you received a disaster loan grant, such that that needs to be calculated into the amount that you're being forgiven.
Any more
Any
questions?
last questions?
Well, thanks, Husch Blackwell. I appreciate it. And again, this will be on video. We'll get that contact info out to you all as soon as Micah got our way. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you all. It's a pleasure.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.